In the last weeks of May 2025, the online community exploded with outrage when it was announced that Annabelle, the supposedly possessed doll that inspired the movies bearing her name, was going to be moved from where she was. The reason? To tour various cities under the guise of being exhibited to curious spectators. According to the harshest internet critics, it was being done solely to continue promoting movies. An action that, moreover, was carried out without considering the possible danger of the object in question. The heated debates didn't take long to start. Some even went so far as to say that Annabelle had taken advantage of all the commotion to escape. Videos circulated telling how the doll had disappeared when her guards were distracted, and the matter went viral. This caused a few brief hours of panic. What if what was being said about her was true? What if human ambition had resulted in the release of a terrible presence that could wreak havoc on its surroundings? Everything calmed down when it was revealed that it had been fake news. Anyway, the matter served to reopen old questions. How much truth was there in the story of Annabelle? The possible answers were quick to be heard, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. If today Annabelle is in a glass case, it's thanks to those who put her there, the ones who made her famous more than 50 years ago. And it's about them that we need to talk. What were the first steps of these very particular investigators? How did they achieve the fame they attained? Why did they have so many detractors? What evidence of scams was there in their cases? Did they really fight against evil, or were they just people with a great ability to deceive others? What did a girl who used to be seen with them accuse them of? What legacy did their files leave behind? What is there today in the museum they put together with everything they collected during their years fighting demons? To try to answer these and other questions, we're going to dive into this special about the Warrens. Welcome to one of these new specials that we're doing on the channel from time to time. If you haven't seen the previous ones, I invite you to watch them. We did one about the Amityville case, which is closely related to this one about the Warrens. I'll link the video at the end if you haven't seen it yet. And we also have one about the Columbine case, which is also super thorough and lasts about an hour. I invite you to go watch it if you haven't seen it yet. And we also have others about cryptids, Bigfoot, and so on, so I'll leave the link at the end. If you're interested in or enjoy this kind of long format video, I invite you to write the word special in the comments, because this is a special about the Warrens. And if we get more than 2,000 people commenting special, we'll make another one. And I also invite you, of course, to leave suggestions about what topics you would like us to cover in a 1-hour special. And I would also like to see your comments about the Warrens. What do you think about the Warrens? Were they real? Are they a fraud? What do you think about this couple? But not now, not now. First, watch the whole video and then draw your own conclusions. Now it's time to relax, turn off the lights, and start this special about the Warrens. An encounter that would change everything. When The Conjuring hit theaters in 2014, the horror genre experienced a major resurgence. It also marked the start of one of the highest-grossing sagas in recent years. A saga that would not be lacking in curses, possessions, and all kinds of scares. But The Conjuring would not only show how much ghost stories can earn, but it would also put the spotlight on two very particular people who are absolutely relevant in the paranormal universe. Two people who had already conquered popular culture a few years ago, but who would regain their relevance with the movies from that saga. Without them, certain ideas that we now take for granted would never have been created. And it's even likely that without their influence, what we know or think we know about exorcisms and haunted houses, for example, wouldn't be the same. It may sound exaggerated, but it's not. The first thing we need to know is that most of the cases we know about the Warrens before they became public figures, we know from the Warrens themselves. And the story they made sure to immortalize begins with a little girl born in Bridgeport, Connecticut on January 31st, 1927. Coming from a very religious family, this girl, baptized as Lorraine Rita Moran, would spend her first years of study in a Catholic school for girls. It was there, at just 7 years old, that Lorraine would discover she was not like the rest of her classmates. One morning like any other, She had approached one of the nuns who were always walking around the grounds and told her that she was dazzled by the lights coming from her body. The nun looked at her with a furrowed brow, not quite understanding what the other was saying. Lorraine smiled and repeated to her that the powerful glow she was giving off was nothing short of hypnotic. When her interlocutor remained serious, the girl dropped her cheerful expression. As she would later recount, ever since she could remember, she had been able to see certain luminescences emanating from people and animals. Something she had believed happened to everyone until that day. The nun she had spoken to punished her for being considered a liar and forced her to spend the afternoon praying. Lorraine obeyed without flinching, but while prayers came out of her mouth, everything in her mind was turned upside down. Why did the nun look at her that way? Was she special? Would talking about that gift only bring her trouble? Maybe it was better to keep all of this hidden? Things didn't get better when, a little older, she read about the aura and went to her parents with excitement, thinking she had solved the mystery. Without much preamble, she informed them that she believed she could see the specific energy mentioned in parapsychology magazines. Her parents told her the joke wasn't funny and considered the matter closed. When Lorraine tried with her friends, she only managed to make them laugh and then change the subject. It appeared that discussing her true situation was not a viable choice. So the young woman spent the following years enjoying her uniqueness, but without sharing it with the world. This made her a somewhat lonely person, something she quickly got used to. With a curious spirit, Lorraine would spend hours and hours in her room going through old books, drawn to fictional worlds and ancient treatises. To her intellectual life was added a love for theater, a passion she shared with her mother. It was because of this that one day, when she was 16 years old, both of them went to the Colonial Bridgeport Theater, one of the most luxurious in the area. Once there, Lorraine was amazed. But not because of the drama unfolding on stage, but because of the presence of a boy her own age who worked seating the audience. The young people barely had time to exchange glances, but that was enough. It's unclear if Lorraine noticed a special aura about him, but we know she had fallen in love. After the show, she was pleasantly surprised when the young man approached her to talk. There was obvious chemistry between them. She reached out her hand and introduced herself. He shook it firmly and said his name was Ed. It was the beginning of a relationship that would leave a lasting mark on the world of esotericism and occultism. When Lorraine and Ed discovered they got along well, they started seeing each other without anyone else around. In those private conversations, where they laughed and flirted, certain confidences began to slip in. That way, Lorraine had discovered that Ed, just like her, had gotten used to not sharing certain things that happened to him. The boy was born on September 7, 1926, and his childhood went by without major upheavals until he was 5 years old. Then, everything had turned into a nightmare. From that age until 12, he claimed to have been the victim of very difficult-to-explain phenomena. Phenomena that made him ridiculed by other kids and doubted by his parents. Ed had his bed facing a huge closet between 2 and 3 in the morning. That closet stopped being a harmless piece of furniture to become the main character in his deepest fears. The door of it would open by itself, and the frightened boy would see some hostile presences parade in front of him. The most frequent one was an old woman who watched him angrily and seemed to threaten him with her gestures. Right after that, the temperature would drop, steam would start coming out of his mouth, and whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once would fill everything. There were also some strange scratches coming from under the bed. His room basically would go from being in absolute silence to being filled with sounds that were impossible to trace. How did that end? With Ed getting into his parents' bed, who would scold him and tell him he was too old to be acting like a coward? Just like Lorraine, he had convinced himself that the best thing he could do to avoid being seen as crazy was not to mention it. Not that, nor the other details that according to him made his childhood home a haunted house. As you can imagine, Ed and Lorraine felt very comfortable having found each other. In their own way, both were outsiders, who had gotten used to lying to those around them, so they wouldn't be labeled as weird. Now, together, the world gave them a kind of comfort that they decided not to waste. That empathy was followed by love, and soon they were engaged and wrapped up in a sort of romance. At least until World War II broke out. Ed enlisted in the Navy at 17 and served his country overseas, while Lorraine dedicated her nightly prayers to him, hoping nothing would happen to him. Prayers that, by the way, bore fruit. At a certain point, the ship Ed was on was sunk, and the young man was one of the few survivors, which earned him a 30-day leave. Without wasting a single second, Ed used those days to return home and propose marriage to Lorraine. He didn't know if he would actually make it out of the conflict alive, and he didn't want to go back to the front without being married to that girl with whom he felt such a deep connection. The ceremony was brief but emotional. When Ed went back to the war, he did so with renewed energy. After a while, he returned safe and sound and was met with a big surprise. Lorraine had given birth to a daughter, the fruit of their love, Judy. The couple finally settled down and devoted themselves to growing as a family. Their only problem was finances. Ed told Lorraine that another one of his passions, aside from everything related to the esoteric, was painting. She became a great admirer of his urban landscapes and was even by his side when he held his first exhibition. However, even though he wasn't bad with a paintbrush, he didn't gain much prestige among other artists. Without losing his enthusiasm and determined not to give up, he got a job as a bus driver to earn money. From this situation, an event would arise that would later make it clear that not everything in those years was as the Warrens told it. We'll discuss this later. For now, just know that Ed kept perfecting himself behind the scenes, and at a certain point, he decided to add paranormal details to his drawings. Ghosts, spirits, demons. Was the result good? He could tell that people looked at his paintings differently, with a strange fascination. Now they were interested. And that night, maybe by chance, was when the Warrens managed to start their first business. Around that time, Lorraine and Ed developed a modus operandi that would open the door to their first investigations. The first step was to notice what people discussed around town. The couple had discovered that if you were persuasive enough, you could come across those kinds of stories that are usually whispered when the lights go out or as evening falls. Stories that speak of beings that shouldn't be in this realm, or of the dead who return from who knows where to claim what they believe belongs to them. They also discovered that, although everyone seemed skeptical at first, it was enough to stoke the fire a little for real fears to emerge. In the light of rationality, all those things seem silly. Then, one step further beyond the limits of uncertainty. Everyone ended up agreeing with that old saying that witches don't exist, but if they do, they do. This showed the Warrens that they weren't strange for being fascinated by the paranormal. They were just the visible part of an entire society that most of the time preferred to pretend it was much braver than it really was. So many stories were heard during those years that they were able to make their own map with all the houses that were rumored to be haunted in the neighborhood. And what did they do next? They would simply go to one of these places and stand in front of the property. Ed would take out his brushes and start painting under the scrutiny of Lorraine, who would occasionally close her eyes and stretch out her hands, as if in a trance. After a while, this behavior started to attract the attention of the homeowners. Then, the Warrens would deliver the final blow. With a big grin, Ed introduced himself and showed the drawing to the homeowners. A realistic painting of their home brought a smile to their faces. After a few seconds, they would notice something else. The drawing always showed strange shadows lurking around the garden or appearing in the windows. When asked why he had painted that, Ed never lost his composure. With a calm and friendly tone, he explained that both he and his partner were able to see things that others couldn't. In other words, what could be seen in the drawings was nothing more than the manifestations that they, thanks to their more developed senses, were able to perceive. And that wasn't all. Lorraine would then suggest to her interlocutor that they could give them the drawing as a gift, as long as they let them visit the property inside, out of curiosity and because maybe they knew how to help. The reactions were quite varied. Some ended up throwing the strange couple out without much explanation, certainly feeling invaded. Others hesitated, and maybe they remembered how a door had opened by itself at night, or the sound of footsteps that could be heard in supposedly empty rooms. The Warrens started conducting their own investigations. According to what they said, they didn't charge any money. Often, Ed would conduct investigations with a recorder in hand, while Lorraine, with her emotions on the surface, let herself be guided by visions. They collected testimonies, recorded electronic voice phenomenon, took photographs, and above all, left their mark: crosses, holy water, and a clear warning: evil was real and you had to stay alert. In this way, their reputation grew, and with it, the cases also increased. They began to hear more stories. Darker, more gruesome, more twisted. With their first collection of their own files, in 1952, the Warrens founded the New England Society for Psychic Research, the first organization dedicated to paranormal investigation in the United States. The goal was simple: to document, study, and if possible, free people from demonic presences or evil entities that inhabited their homes. Their letters of introduction started becoming more solemn at that point. She proclaimed herself a medium and clairvoyant, while he called himself a self-taught demonologist. They also refined their personalities. She was almost a martyr, always sympathetic and understanding, going through sensations that overwhelmed her. He never lost his composure, he was serious and brought calm with his deep voice. They didn't know it, or maybe they did, but they were laying the cornerstone of what would eventually become a true empire. Restless and always in action, they began to publish several books, all short works but with a big impact, where they recorded their adventures. In fact, in print format, they narrated one of their most astonishing exploits, having investigated the Borley Rectory in Essex, which is reputed to be the most haunted house in England. Over time, someone would say that, while in England, the Warrens had only been on the grounds surrounding the property, never actually entering it. But those rumors didn't matter. The books sold better than the paintings. And people were already starting to reach out to Eddie Lorraine without them having to go door to door. No one knew how much of it was true or false. What was clear was that the couple had a real passion for everything esoteric and also for money. Or is this what those who looked at them with suspicion claimed? And the truth is, in a short time, the Warrens began to get involved in cases that would bring them worldwide fame, while also significantly increasing their income. One of those early cases was that of the already mentioned Annabelle. She is small, made of cloth, apparently harmless. Her face doesn't have the mocking smile or the glassy porcelain eyes that movies have made us believe. She doesn't resemble Chucky or the Victorian display case horrors. Annabelle looks like she stepped right out of a 1950s children's catalog. But beneath that simple facade, according to the Warrens, hides one of the most dangerous entities they ever faced in their entire career. Annabelle is not just a case. She's a symbol, an emblem of everything the Warrens stood for. Possessed objects, open doors, evil entities disguised as innocence. Her story began in 1970. A young woman named Donna, a nursing student, lived with her roommate Angie in a modest apartment. As a birthday present, her mother gave her a Raggedy Ann ragdoll, bought at one of the antique stores. At first, Annabelle was just decoration, but little by little they began to notice strange things. The doll, for example, would change positions without anyone touching it. Sometimes it would appear in different rooms, and other times it would leave notes written on parchment paper that said things like, "Help us" or "Help me," even though there was no parchment in the house and no one remembered having that kind of ink or handwriting. But the most disturbing thing was when they found Annabelle with blood on her hands. Frightened, the girls contacted a medium. She revealed to them that the spirit of a girl named Annabelle Higgins had possessed the doll. According to the story, Annabelle had died tragically on the grounds where the building was constructed, and her spirit was seeking refuge. The girls, moved by her story, gave her permission to stay. That was when, in the words of the Warrens, they made the fatal mistake. The manifestations soon intensified, including bangs, noises, and shadows. Lou, a friend of the young women, started having nightmares about the doll, including one where Annabelle was strangling him. Days later, he woke up with claw marks on his chest. That's when the Warrens came into the picture. After analyzing the case, Ed determined that it had all been a trap. According to him, the spirit had never been a little girl. That story had been a facade to win the girl's sympathy. A facade perpetuated by whom? by a demon that had used that emotional disguise to get permission and thus inhabit the object? The Warren team, along with a priest, performed a blessing at the place and removed the doll. After briefly analyzing it, they took it to their home and locked it in a glass case. They put a lock on the case and just in case placed a clear warning not to open it. It's worth mentioning that none of the reported incidents have official documentation. You probably know this story too, but with some details changed. As time went by, the myth was fed by different versions. It's also important to point out that the supposed parchment paper was never preserved or analyzed, and there are no photographs or real records of the exorcism. The young man Lou, the alleged victim, never appeared publicly to confirm the attacks. Furthermore, several rationalist researchers believe that the Warrens simply took an ordinary doll. They made up a demonic background for it and used it as the main attraction of their then precarious museum, a museum that would soon grow and grow. And even more so when it came into the hands of the Warrens, the story that would turn them into public figures. I'm talking about the Perron family case. The movie The Conjuring is supposed to be an adaptation of this case. For many people, the movie takes too many creative liberties, aiming to increase a level of terror that wasn't really there. On the other hand, those who believe suggest the screenwriters didn't go far enough. In the early 70s, the Perron family, made up of Roger, Caroline, and their 5 daughters, moved to an old colonial farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island. From the very first days, they began to notice strange things. Footsteps in the attic, nauseating smells that appeared out of nowhere, objects moving on their own, and shadows lurking from the corners. But the most terrifying thing was the apparitions. The daughters described figures of women with disfigured faces, while Caroline, the mother, felt that a presence was trying to possess her. The local story spoke of a woman named Bathsheba, who was accused of witchcraft in the 19th century. It was said that she had sacrificed her son as an offering to Satan and then hanged herself on the property. The Warrens arrived after being contacted by Caroline Lorraine upon entering the house. She claimed that there was a dark entity that indeed presented itself as Bathsheba, but in reality, it was a demonic spirit in disguise. According to Ed, the entity was seeking to control Caroline in order to destroy her family from within. During their intervention, the Warrens conducted spiritual cleansing sessions, but a formal exorcism was never performed. As the phenomena intensified, Roger expelled the Warrens from the house, fearing that their rituals would make things worse. The family stayed in the house for almost 10 years, and although the phenomena never completely disappeared, they managed to live with them until they finally moved out. In later years, Andrea Perron, one of the daughters, wrote 3 books about what happened, claiming that everything was real. According to her, Hollywood barely scratched the surface of what really happened. Skeptics, of course, point to a number of issues that could undermine everything: the lack of physical evidence, the isolation of the farm as fertile ground for suggestion, and the possibility that certain visions were the result of stress and confinement. It would also start to repeat itself, something that the couple's detractors would not fail to notice in the cases to come. The Warrens relied on the testimonies of frightened people who were often vulnerable for some reason, whether it was addictions, debts, or psychological problems. So, were the Warrens beginning to be more deeply connected with that hidden universe they professed so much, or were they just taking their first steps? Like the manipulators that many people believe they are? Nowadays, the current owner of the land where the Perron family lived did her own investigation with private investigators, with whom she has worked to refute the stories of witchcraft and tragic deaths in that house. Although her reports are well documented, few people pay attention to them. A ghost story is always more appealing. Anyway, working on the Perron case got the Warrens their first television coverage. By then, Ed's past as a bus driver had been left behind. And although he still painted, he had much less time to do it. Now he had become an exorcist, or so he said. In fact, he boasted about being the only lay exorcist. His and Lorraine's life in the paranormal world was just beginning. Very soon, the case that would catapult them would arrive. I'm talking about a case as terrible as it is fascinating. Amityville. I want to remind you that we already did an hour-long special on the Amityville case, covering absolutely everything about it. So if you haven't seen it, I invite you to watch it. I'll leave the link at the end of this video. When Amityville is mentioned, most people think of a 3-story Dutch colonial house with 2 eye-shaped windows staring into the void. Over the decades, it became an icon of horror. It is also the epicenter of books, movies, documentaries, and nightmares. Many nightmares. But before it was a franchise, Amityville was a real case that shocked a society. Or at least that's what was said. The story is appealing for a very specific reason. It combines murder, demonic possessions, and dark presences, and the Warrens, of course. But it's also full of contradictions, uncomfortable silences, and accusations of fraud. It is, in many ways, the perfect example of how myth can devour the truth. In November, a young man named Ronald Bach DeFeo, 23 years old, showed up at a local bar under the influence of drugs. Shouting, he said that someone had killed his family. Indeed, his parents and 4 siblings had been murdered with multiple gunshots. There were no signs of struggle, and for some reason the neighbors hadn't heard anything. At first, DeFeo spoke about the possible involvement of the mafia, but his alibis quickly fell apart, and it was proven that he had played an active role in the murders. The young man was quickly arrested, and a trial followed months later, which instead of clarifying things, opened more and more doors. DeFeo gave many versions of the events, some of them really outlandish. When he didn't know what else to add, he played his last card and claimed that voices in the house had ordered him to kill. No one believed him, and he was convicted. The story could have ended there, but nothing could be further from the truth. In December of 1975, George and Kathy Lutz, along with their 3 children, moved into the house where everything had taken place. They bought it at a reduced price, believing they had made the deal of their lives. However, 28 days later, they would end up leaving the place without even having unpacked their suitcases. The reasons? The house seemed alive and didn't want them there. George Lutz, in turn, had started to change. He had become irritable and cold. He would wake up every night at 3:15 antemeridium, the supposed time of the murders, and would spend hours staring at the fire as if in a trance. His wife began to suffer from visions, and his children were attacked from the shadows. And that wasn't all. Strange footprints appeared outside the property. The walls were stained red, the family dog barked at nothing, and the doors jumped off their hinges. In 1976, Ed and Lorraine were invited by a television channel to investigate the house. According to Lorraine, the energy of the place was unbearably dark. During the session, she claimed to feel the presence of something inhuman. Ed took photographs, recorded sounds, and one of his assistants captured one of the most famous images: the ghostly figure of a boy peeking out from a supposedly empty room. Who was that entity? The Warrens claimed that they had never felt a presence as strong as the one in Amityville. However, over time, some facades, some masks began to fall. A few months later, the Lutz family collaborated with the author Jay Anson, who wrote the book The Amityville Horror, a book that sold millions of copies and was adapted into a movie in 1979. Since then, the house became a legend, at least until Ronald DeFeo's lawyer, William Weber, stated that he himself had invented the story with the Lutz family to make money from a book, and to see if in this way he could manage to free his client. When this came to light, controversies began to arise. And many of those who until that moment had said they felt something in the house retracted their statements or stopped giving interviews. The new owners of the property, who lived there for more than a decade, said that nothing strange ever happened to them. Independent investigators found inconsistencies in the testimony of the Lutz family. Even the famous photo of the ghost boy was questioned. It was discovered that a member of the team was wearing a white shirt and was accidentally photographed with a long exposure. What did the Warrens know? And what had they decided to keep quiet about? It's impossible to know. Had they been deceived by the Lutz family, or were they accomplices in a setup? Ed and Lorraine always defended the case. Until the end of their days, they maintained that what happened in Amityville was real, but the physical evidence didn't support them, nor did the witnesses. Even George Lutz was sued for falsifying facts in the book. The case was dissected by skeptics like Joy Nickel, who labeled it as a paranormal marketing story. A well-crafted setup that mixed the morbid curiosity of a real crime with the fascination for the occult. Stephen King was adamant that the story revolved around a family with a substantial debt succumbing to their stress. I insist once again that if you want to know all the details about Amityville, not like in this video where we just touched on the case briefly, go watch the special we made on this channel. You might be surprised by the information we provide there. Amityville shows that many times the truth doesn't matter as much as the story. Even though most of the elements were debunked, the case is still relevant. But in the midst of all that, the Warrens established themselves as the visible faces of the mystery. Even though they didn't solve the case, even though they never offered solid evidence, even though they weren't even that involved with what happened, then their image became forever associated with the cursed house. In addition, they started cashing big checks from Hollywood, which from then on began contacting them as consultants for horror movies. Suddenly, the Warrens' appearances on television and radio shows multiplied. They had become authorities. A voice of authority with serious faces. They went through studios full of lights, gave lectures and did interviews. They kept cashing checks and documenting cases. The curious case. In 1977, the United Kingdom was going through an economic crisis, and many working-class families were living on the edge of poverty. One of them was the Hoxton family, made up of a single mother, Peggy, and her 4 children. In that context, one of the most well-documented yet questioned cases of alleged paranormal activity in history occurred. It all began in August of that year, in a council house at 284 Green Street, Janet. One of the 11-year-old daughters started saying that her bed would move by itself during the night. At first, her mother thought it was a joke, but the events quickly escalated. Not only did they start dealing with banging on the walls, unexplained noises, and furniture moving in front of witnesses, but they also began to live with guttural voices that started coming from Janet herself. That deep masculine voice introduced itself as the spirit of a man named Bill Wilkins, a former tenant who had died in the same house. The phenomena were witnessed by neighbors, police officers, and even detectives who approached in disbelief. The Daily Mirror covered the case, sending photographers and reporters who corroborated each and everything the family said. Soon, the case was taken up by investigators from the Society for Physical Research, particularly Maurice Grosset and Guy Lyon Playfire, who documented the phenomena for months. These individuals kept a meticulous log of the tormented days the family had to go through. It was then that, among all the flashes and recorders, Ed and Lorraine Warren appeared. According to some records, the Warrens were only in Enfield for a couple of days, unlike the entire year that the British investigators spent there. However, their account differs. Ed Warren asserted that the Enfield case involved demonic possession. Lorraine, as always, felt an evil presence upon entering. According to them, Janet was being used as a conduit by a non-human entity. In the Conjuring movies, this involvement was exaggerated, showing the Warrens as the central protagonists of the case. And as they say, their intervention was not only brief but also highly questioned. Guy Lyon Playfair went so far as to state, the Warrens came without invitation, looking to capitalize on the case. They were more interested in getting paid than in investigating. Ignoring the criticism, the Warrens added Enfield to their list of supernatural experiences, extreme. Beyond the controversies and the possible frauds that people tried to prove, it's important to focus on a very interesting detail. As we mentioned, the Warrens' presence was nearly symbolic in this instance. Even so, today there are still people who think of them when Enfield is mentioned. This shows the great power that Ed and Lorraine had to add to their own catalog cases in which they barely participated. That's how it can be explained why at some point they claim to have been involved in more than 10,000 anomalous events. Enfield is also, for many, the proof that Ed and Lorraine did not respect the work of other colleagues. That's why, little by little, they would start to be despised by those who shared their interests. And the criticism only got worse when in 1981 they were accused of wanting to collaborate to set a dangerous murderer free. The devil forced them to do it. In 1981, the town of Brookfield, Connecticut became the scene of an unprecedented event. It all started with a crime. A 19-year-old young man, Arne Cheyenne Johnson, stabbed and killed his landlord, Alan Bono, after a heated argument. The murder was witnessed by Arne's girlfriend and her little sister. But what seemed to be a crime of passion with excessive alcohol soon turned into a sinister episode. That would involve demonic possession, exorcism, and the Warrens at the center of the storm? And it was quickly said that the genesis of that drama had taken place a few months earlier. And the main character was the younger brother of Arne's fiancée, an 11-year-old boy named David Glatzel. According to his family, David began to act strangely after visiting an old house. He said he saw a figure of an old man with black eyes, hooved feet, and a cavernous voice. He went unnoticed until he began growling, speaking in tongues, convulsing, and having violent outbursts. The Glatzel family asked the church for help, but when they didn't get a quick response, they turned to Ed and Lorraine Warren, who declared that David was possessed by multiple demons. According to Lorraine, during the exorcism process, which was witnessed by Catholic priests and the family, Arne challenged the demon and said, and I quote, "Come into me instead." From that point, the Warrens and the family claimed the darkness had moved to him. Arne began to show erratic behavior. He would go into trances, mumble nonsense, claim to see the figure of the demon in the woods, and had memory lapses. Basically, his personality had changed. Months later, the brutal murder of his landlord took place on a night when they had indulged in alcoholic drinks. When the case went to court, Arne's legal defense, led by attorney Martin Minella, made history. Did he try to use demonic possession as a defense argument? He claimed that Arne was not responsible for his actions because he was not the one controlling his body. The press went wild. The case turned into a media circus. It was the first time in United States history that the legal defense for a crime was alleged demonic possession. The Warrens gave lectures, interviews, and even sold the rights to the story. But Judge Robert Callahan flatly rejected the supernatural argument. He ruled there was no legal basis to judge the existence of spirits or demons, and that the defense should focus on the defendant's mental health. Arne was convicted of first-degree homicide and sentenced to 10 to 20 years. However, he only served 5 years in prison for good behavior. He was released in 1986. He married his girlfriend at the time and has kept a low profile since his release. To this day, he maintains he was not in control of himself and has never recanted. This case marked a turning point in the reputation of the Warrens. On one hand, it made them much more famous, but on the other, it increased skepticism about them. Moreover, two things were undeniable. If the Warrens acted solely out of self-interest, they had agreed to defend a killer. Not to mention that by assisting the possessed boy, they had contributed to preventing real help from reaching someone who might have been suffering from schizophrenia or childhood psychosis. There are many rumors. The Warrens allegedly publicized the case in return for its story rights. Meanwhile, others say they didn't even know the people involved. Until the defense attorneys hired them and told them what story they should tell. Is that what these so-called investigators had become? Into a card that lawyers used to play when they no longer knew how to get their clients out of trouble? Did they build their fortune on that? As is clear, up to that point, Ed and Lorraine were as admired as they were hated. They continued, unsurprisingly. The SMORD case is one of the darkest in the Warren archive, although it was never adapted by Hollywood on a large scale. It happened between 1974 and 1989, and it was the subject of books, interviews, and even a made-for-television movie. But beyond the media spotlight, what supposedly happened in that house in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, still disturbs those who investigate it. Jack and Janice Merle lived with their daughters in a duplex next to Jack's parents. After a series of repairs due to a flood, the phenomena began. Lights that flickered for no reason, doors that opened and closed by themselves, banging on the walls, and pets that behaved erratically and aggressively. A typical yet uncommonly aggressive poltergeist set this case apart from others. While the mother and grandmother were scratched by an invisible force, Jack claimed to have been abused by a demonic entity. For years, the family lived in torment. The local church refused to intervene directly, so they turned to Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens claimed that the house was under attack by a very ancient high-level demon. During their visits, Lorraine claimed to see a black human-shaped shadow and to feel a presence as strong as in Amityville. They brought in a priest who performed several blessings, but according to the Warrens, that only made the events worse. Jack suffered from episodes of sleep paralysis accompanied by visions. Janet would get sick for no apparent reason, and the eldest daughter started talking to herself, saying that someone was whispering things to her from the closet. Finally, after a series of exorcisms approved by the church, the phenomena slowly ceased, although never completely. The case was covered by the Scranton Times, and later the book The Haunted was published, co-authored with the Warrens. But criticism soon arose when an archbishop denied having authorized any official exorcism on that property. However, the neighbors claimed they never witnessed anything unusual. And an independent paranormal investigator, Paul Kurtz, concluded that the phenomena were the result of hallucinations and family dysfunction. Jack and Janet always maintained their version that their house was invaded by evil and that the Warrens were the only ones who tried to help them, really. Again, there were some who accused Eddie and Lorraine of taking advantage of people with more complex problems. Not only feeding their fantasies anymore, but also interfering with treatment that could actually help them. Were the Warrens really capable of psychologically destroying anyone just to sell more rights and keep growing in status? One way or another, they were so popular in the late 80s and early 90s that they decided to open a new side of their business. And that's how our story goes back to the beginning. The Museum of the Occult. The files that Ed and Lorraine managed to accumulate also included exorcisms of werewolves, and even a recording of the famous Lady in White. In their own way, the Warrens touched on each and every topic of scary stories, always adding their own unique mystique. But once the cases were closed, the investigators didn't just write books, suggesting movie adaptations or appearing on television shows. Television to repeatedly deliver experiences that left viewers craving more. Slowly but surely, the Warrens began to build one of the most well-known collections of supposedly cursed objects. And the thing is, Ed and Lorraine didn't just expel spirits. Many times, according to their version, they identified objects that acted as conduits or anchors for demonic entities. These objects were taken to their house. Why? Simple. Showing a stoic and committed character, the Warrens proclaimed themselves as guardians capable of keeping evil at bay. All based on daily prayers, holy water, and unwavering faith. Thus, a suburban home's basement in Monroe, Connecticut, turned into an odd storage space, filled with mysterious statues and other objects. Tribal masks, grimoires, porcelain dolls, and dozens of urns sealed with strange inscriptions. Every piece kept there has a hidden story, stories that, in many cases, remain dormant to this day. At a certain point, the basement opened its doors to the public and was named the Warrens Museum of the Occult. For a few bills, anyone could visit this sanctuary, where some of the most dangerous objects in the world are displayed on its shelves. Signs like "Do not open," "Do not touch," or "Caution" can be seen in different corners, which, of course, helped increase the public's excitement. In just a few months, the museum became a landmark for followers of the paranormal. There, for example, they could meet the real Annabelle, who, as we mentioned, rests inside a glass case properly sanctified to appease her dark energies. Even so, neither the glass case nor the prayers were enough in some of these cases. The Warrens maintained that Annabelle remained powerful, even when locked away, recounting multiple instances to support this claim. Incidents related to her. The most well-known of these incidents was that of a young man who had visited the museum in a mocking tone just to discredit it. It is said that the boy knocked on the doll's glass and then whispered something which supposedly condemned him. No one really knew what the boy said while looking at Annabelle's face. The most widespread rumor is that he challenged her, something like that. "If you really have powers, prove it." He left the museum laughing out loud, calling everyone waiting to get in naive. That same afternoon, he died in an accident after his motorcycle unexpectedly malfunctioned and caused him to lose his balance. Sometime later, a priest who had labeled the Warrens as liars dismissed the influence of the doll in front of the media, and just a few hours later, his car was hit by a truck. As with everything surrounding Eddie Lorraine, there is no evidence of these cases, although they made sure to tell these stories over and over again. Was it a genuine warning to keep other visitors out of trouble, or was it an excellent marketing strategy to give the place an even creepier aura? Annabelle is not alone. The museum is full of artifacts just as dark as the doll. Let's get to know some of them. The so-called satanic idol is a statue that was found in the forest of Connecticut during a black magic ritual. According to the Warrens, every previous owner of the idol had died under tragic circumstances. The Conjuring mirror is the not at all metaphorical name of a mirror that was supposedly used in necromancy rituals. It is said that anyone who looks into it for too long begins to see another version of themselves. On the other hand, the shadow of the Beast Man is a wooden figure brought from Haiti. According to Ed, it caused night attacks and visions of horned entities. The museum also has its own organ, but of course, it's not an ordinary organ where visitors sit down to play a classical piece. It's an organ that plays in the early hours of the morning without anyone touching it, for anyone who wants to listen. The Warrens used to say that destroying those objects was not an option. In fact, breaking any of these items would be the equivalent of releasing those forces or entities that, for some reason, had taken hold of them. The museum never allowed external studies nor independent monitoring. Many researchers visited it and after taking note of every story they heard there, were unable to trace the veracity of any of them. According to Lorraine, it's because many people had entrusted them with those relics, never to mention them again. For years, hundreds of people went down the narrow stairs that led to that basement. But near the end of the previous millennium, the excitement about this pair of investigators had started to wane. After spending decades as the standard bearers of the intriguing, it seemed that the Warrens were losing their privileged place in pop culture. On August 23, 2006, Ed, 79 years old, died from complications of a stroke. He couldn't witness how in 2014, after the release of The Conjuring, his last name returned to the spotlight. He also couldn't defend himself when, in 2017, The Hollywood Reporter published an article with serious accusations. A woman named Judith Penny stated that she had a romantic relationship with Ed Warren since she was 15 years old, while he was already over 30. All with Lorraine's consent. Judith added that she lived in the Warrens' house for decades. She also claimed that the Warrens handled everything as a business, and that the cases were carefully modified to maximize their literary or cinematic value. She also stated that many times Ed would emotionally manipulate the witnesses and always tried to make the story fit the demonic pattern. Even if there was no evidence of it, this left a deep stain on their reputation as faith-based investigators. Furthermore, as we have shown, the most common criticism of the Warrens is not that they were completely fake, but that they mixed truth and lies in a dangerous alchemy. They possibly helped people who were going through moments of emotional or psychological imbalance, but at the same time, they fueled those fears, ritualized them, and commercialized them. Ed and Lorraine understood something that few paranormal investigators had grasped up to that point: the power of narrative. It wasn't enough to experience a phenomenon. You had to tell the story, make it unforgettable, and the Warrens did that better than anyone. To their followers, they were the guardians of the threshold. To their critics, they were simply a couple of con artists, eager to ruin lives. While the world knew them as the most famous paranormal investigators in modern history, an increasingly large group of journalists, scientists, and even people close to the victims themselves began to raise an uncomfortable accusation. It was all a show, a carefully staged performance to build a spiritual empire. The testimony of Judith Penny seemed to reinforce this idea. Apart from her word, the woman presented a large number of photographs that proved she had indeed known the Warrens since she was a minor. She had even accompanied them to cover many of the cases that would later make them famous. Ed and Lorraine introduced her as just an assistant. Over the years, Judith's accusation was widely analyzed. If the Warrens wanted to have an open relationship, there's no reason to be shocked. But was it true that Ed had started a relationship with her when she was underage? Did this make him out to be a manipulator? Was his wife a passive accomplice? Many suggest that it's likely some film studios helped ensure that what Judith said didn't have the impact it should have had. All just to ruin the already questionable reputation of these investigators, whose adventures brought and still bring them millions in revenue. Others wonder if it wasn't Judith who was trying to take advantage. Lorraine preferred never to comment on the subject. She kept a suggestive silence until April 18, 2019, when she died. She took all the answers with her. With her passing, Fur's career of more than 70 years came to an end. The big question at that moment was, who was going to take care of her legacy? For that, we need to talk about Judy again, but not Judy Penny, who was the one who accused Ed Warren, but another Judy. Because it turns out that the daughter Ed and Lorraine Warren had was also named Judy. The Heirs. Judy Warren came into the world on January 11, 1946 in Connecticut, when her parents still weren't hosting primetime shows, and when most of the cases that would make them icons had not yet taken place. According to the girl, her parents were very active people, always involved in different projects and with an amazing quality. They threw the best Halloween parties in the neighborhood. Yes, when that time of year came when houses were filled with smiling pumpkins and prop skulls, Ed and Lorraine took care of decorating their house with all kinds of gadgets. That was the image of her parents that Judy repeated the most in many of the interviews she gave. Two adults with abundant imagination and in love with all the supernatural paraphernalia. In fact, Judy never hesitated to refer to Eddie Lorraine as artists. Perhaps settling with that some other rather thorny issues. That being said, the Warren heiress said that she was always very fearful and that at a certain age she started being raised by her grandmother, since her parents began their well-known trips around the world hunting ghost stories. In 1979, at 33 years old, Judy met Tony Espira, a man who worked as a police officer in Bloomfield, Connecticut. The spark between them was immediate, and sooner rather than later they began an intense love story. When Tony met his in-laws, he was fascinated and left the police force to deepen his knowledge in the world of demonology. From then on, he trained in the dark arts. According to what he would later say, Tony found great emotional and spiritual support in Eddie Lorraine. The man had lost his mother and his brother, and when the others assured him that life after death was real, he found a new philosophy of life and embraced faith with an enthusiasm that, until then, he didn't think was part of his nature. Over time, Tony began to work with the Warrens, helped them with investigations, accompanied them on tours, and provided his knowledge as a former police officer to give their books a more professional character. Because of all this, it's not surprising that when Lorraine passed away, Tony was left in charge of the Warrens Museum. However, he was only able to manage it for a year, since in 2020 the place was closed by order of the municipality. The reason? He didn't have the permits to operate as an attraction open to the public. It was located in a residential area, and the constant visits from fans disturbed the peace of the neighbors. They had gotten tired of seeing fans of The Conjuring around there, looking for some kind of experience connected to the afterlife. Tony promised to reopen it somewhere else, but that hasn't happened yet. From time to time, the man posts videos showing the objects and reminding anyone who wants to listen that they are not toys but something that must be respected. It was also Tony who decided to take Annabelle to several cities, which earned him criticism from the most fundamentalist people who dealt with him. If he wasn't truly honoring the Warrens, Tony laughed off the criticism and pointed out that both Ed and Lorraine had taken Annabelle out of the museum on many occasions. According to him, what happens is that nobody really knows anything about the Warrens. So much has been said about them over time that a completely distorted image has already been created of who they were and how they did things. They basically became myths. Open case conclusions. It's impossible not to find certain unquestionable points in the words of men like the famous skeptic Joy Nickel, who dismantled much of the Warren file and ended up calling them charlatans with a crucifix. On his side was Paul Kurtz, philosopher and founder of the Center for Inquiry. He concluded their cases could be summarized into three main groups: those that were actually collective hysteria, those that were about undiagnosed mental illnesses, and those that quite simply were evidence of a perverse emotional manipulation. However, what his defenders claim is also true. Thanks to the Warrens, spiritualism, which had reached its peak in the 1920s, was able to reinvent itself in times when reason sought to prevail. There are those who say that even if they weren't entirely honest, the Warrens served as a protective symbol for all those stories they enjoyed since they were young. When Lorraine saw Auras and Ed still had nightmares about the monsters from his childhood. Maybe if it weren't for them, topics like reincarnation or the possibility of contacting the dead wouldn't have been discussed during prime time. Maybe they were tasked with giving a voice to a possibility that otherwise would never have had a chance to be heard. The big problem is how many innocent lives were lost along the way, how many families who needed help ended up being exposed and then discarded, how many people were unable to access real help. Because of the way the Warrens monopolized their cases, how many ended up being labeled as crazy after the spotlight faded and the Warrens walked away counting their money? Could there have been a hint of genuine desire to help in them? Thanks to them, did anyone truly feel accompanied? Moreover, if the Warrens are actually frauds, isn't it possible that they really are? Those who wanted to publish their books, those who interviewed them, or those who gave them large spaces for their conferences? Aren't those who bought the copyrights to those stories that the Warrens put on display also frauds then? So, if it really was the great fraud that everyone claims, were they the cause or just functional cogs in the machine? What do you think about them? I'll read your comments. Anyway, there seems to be only one inflexible point on which everyone agrees. The legacy of the Warrens, for better or worse, seems impossible to exorcise. For now, I'll leave you with other specials that appear here. I thank each and every member of the Mephisto clan, who are the ones appearing here on the side. Thanks to them, we can make these videos. With nothing more to say, I bid farewell. I'm Magnus Mephisto, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye!